There's a version of the gambler that the world never heard, and the only reason it doesn't exist is because of a decision made in a few quiet minutes inside a Nashville studio. It was the spring of 1978 in a recording studio just off Music Row, the kind of building that from the outside looked like almost nothing, a low brick structure with a small parking lot and a single door. No sign announcing what happened inside. Inside, though, was one of the rooms where Nashville's sound was being made, take after take, session after session, by musicians and engineers who had done this so many times that the work had become almost invisible to them. On this particular afternoon, Kenny Rogers stood in the vocal booth, headphones on, looking through the glass at his producer, waiting for the tape to roll on a song that, at that point, was still just one of several songs being considered for an upcoming album. Nobody in that room that day believed they were about to record one of the most recognizable songs in American music. If they had, they might have done something differently, and that's exactly the point. To understand why this moment mattered, it helps to understand where the gambler came from and where Kenny Rogers stood when it arrived in his hands. The song had been written by a young songwriter named Don Schlitz, who had been carrying it around Nashville for years before it found its way to Kenny. By the time it reached him, The Gambler had already been recorded once before by another artist in a version that came and went without much notice. That earlier recording wasn't bad. It simply hadn't found the thing inside the song that would, within a year, make it impossible to turn off the radio without hearing it somewhere. Songs like this moved through Nashville constantly. Passed from songwriter to publisher, from publisher to producer, from producer to artist, each stop a small gamble in itself. Most of these songs never became anything more than album filler, a track between the singles, pleasant enough, but forgettable. The difference between a song that disappeared and a song that became a career-defining hit often had less to do with the song on paper than with what happened to it in the room where it was recorded. The tempo, the phrasing, the small choices that nobody outside the studio would ever think to ask about. By 1978, Kenny Rogers was already a name country audiences recognized, but he was also, in a quieter sense, still in the process of becoming the artist audiences would eventually think of as the Kenny Rogers, the storyteller, the voice behind narrative songs that felt like short films set to music. He had scored hits before. He had momentum. But the kind of song that would define an entire career, the song that would still be played decades later at gatherings of people who could recite every word, that song hadn't arrived yet. Kenny knew, the way artists at this stage of a career often know, that he was looking for something, even if he couldn't have described exactly what it was. He had spent the previous several years moving away from his earlier sound, looking for material that matched not just his voice, but the kind of persona he was beginning to settle into. Warm, wise, a little weathered, the kind of man who seemed like he'd lived the stories he sang about. The Gambler fit that persona almost perfectly on paper. The question was whether it would fit it in the room. The producer working with Kenny that day, Larry Butler, had built a reputation for a particular kind of instinct, the ability to hear a song not just for what it was, but for what it could become with a few adjustments most people wouldn't notice until they were already used to them. Butler had worked with Kenny before, and the two had developed the kind of shorthand that producers and artists build after enough sessions together. A trust that allowed for honest disagreement without either side feeling like the other was overstepping. That trust mattered more than usual on this particular afternoon, because what Butler was about to suggest wasn't a small tweak. It touched the very heart of how the song would feel. The session moved the way most sessions moved. The musicians ran through the arrangement a few times to get comfortable with it. Kenny sang through the song, finding his way into the character at the center of it, the gambler on the train, offering advice to a stranger in exchange for a drink. The early takes were, by most accounts, solid, technically clean. The band was tight, the vocal was strong, and if the session had ended there, the song that went on the album would have been perfectly fine. A good track, competently recorded, the kind of song that might have done reasonably well and then quietly faded into the background of Kenny's catalog, the way the earlier recording by another artist already had. But somewhere in the middle of that session, Larry Butler stopped the tape. What followed wasn't an argument exactly, but it was a moment where two people who trusted each other had to work through a genuine difference of opinion, with the song itself sitting in the balance. Butler had a feeling about the song that went beyond the arrangement they'd been running. He felt that the version they had, while solid, was moving a little too quickly past the heart of what made the song special, the storytelling. In the early takes, the gambler played almost like any other up-tempo country song, a verse, a chorus, energy carried by the band as much as by the lyric. Butler's instinct was that the song needed room to breathe, that the listener needed time to actually picture the train, the gambler, the weary traveler across from him, before the song swept them into the chorus everyone would eventually know by heart. For Kenny, this wasn't a small ask. He had just spent the better part of the session finding his way into a performance that felt good to him, a performance that, on its own terms, worked. Slowing the song down, giving it more space, meant rethinking not just the tempo, but the entire emotional shape of his vocal. It meant trusting that a song could hold an audience's attention by doing less, at exactly the moment when every instinct in a recording session pushes toward more. More energy, more momentum, more reasons for a radio programmer to keep the dial where it was. There's no official transcript of what was said in that booth in the next few minutes. What's clear, from how the session unfolded afterward, is that Kenny didn't dismiss the idea, and he didn't simply defer to it either. He thought about it. He asked questions about where, exactly, the song needed to slow down, about how it would affect the chorus, about whether the band could find that pocket without losing the song's energy entirely. It was the kind of conversation that happens between two people who both care about getting something right, and who both know that the easiest path, finishing the session with what they already had, wasn't necessarily the best one. And then they tried it again. The next take started differently. The tempo eased back, just slightly, not dramatically, not in a way a casual listener would consciously notice, but enough to change how the song moved. Kenny's vocals settled into something more conversational, more like a man telling a story to someone sitting across from him than a singer performing to a room. The opening lines, which in the earlier takes had moved past almost as setup, suddenly had weight. The listener had time to picture the train car, the late hour, the stranger with nothing left but a story worth telling. By the time the song reached its chorus, the now famous lines about knowing when to hold and when to fold, something had shifted. The chorus didn't just arrive, it landed, the way a punchline lands differently, depending on how the story before it was told. The band, following Kenny's lead, found a groove that felt unhurried without ever feeling slow, The kind of tempo that invites a listener to lean in rather than tap their foot. When the take ended, there was a pause in the control room, the specific kind of pause that happens when everyone in a session recognizes, almost simultaneously, that something just happened that hadn't happened in any of the earlier takes. Nobody declared in that moment that they had just recorded a classic. That's not how these things usually work. What they knew, more simply, was that this take felt different, better, in a way that was hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. Butler and Kenny listened back to it together, and the difference between this take and the earlier ones was obvious the moment the playback started. The earlier takes sounded like a good song, performed well. This take sounded like a story being told to you, personally, by someone who had lived it. What happened next was, in some ways, the least dramatic part of the story, and also the part that mattered most. They moved on. The session continued. Other songs were recorded. The album took shape over the following weeks. Nobody threw a party over one take of one song, but that take, the slower, more spacious version, the one where Kenny's vocal had room to tell the story rather than just deliver it, was the one that made it onto the album. The earlier, faster takes were set aside the way alternate takes usually are, filed away, rarely listened to again, footnotes to a session that, on the surface, looked like any other. When The Gambler was released, it became one of the biggest songs of Kenny Rogers' career, and, in time, one of the most recognizable songs in American music, period. It topped the country charts, crossed onto pop radio, and became the title track and centerpiece of an album that would go on to define how audiences thought of Kenny Rogers for the rest of his career. The narrative style of the song, patient, conversational, almost like a short story set to music, became, in many ways, the template for the kind of music Kenny would become best known for. Coward of the County and the songs that followed in its wake all carried something of that same quality, the sense of a story being told by someone who had time to tell it right. For Kenny, The Gambler became more than a hit. It became, in retrospect, the moment his voice and his persona fully aligned with the kind of material that suited him best. Before The Gambler, Kenny Rogers was a successful country artist with a strong voice and good instincts. After it, he was the man who could make an audience feel like they were sitting across from him on a late-night train, listening to a stranger's hard-won wisdom. That shift, subtle as it was, reshaped the rest of his career, opening the door to the storytelling songs that would carry him through the years that followed, and eventually into the pop crossover success that made him a household name far beyond country radio. What makes this story worth telling isn't really about tempo or technical choices in a recording session. Most listeners, then and now, would never consciously notice the difference between the early takes and the one that made the album. What makes it worth telling is what it reveals about how the songs people love most often come to exist in the first place, not through some grand, dramatic moment, but through small, almost invisible decisions made by people who cared enough to stop the tape and ask, quietly, "Is this really the best we can do?" For Larry Butler, that afternoon was one of countless sessions in a long career, but it was also a reminder of something producers rarely get to prove so clearly, that an instinct, even one that asks an artist to do something uncomfortable in the moment, can be the difference between a song that's good and a song that lasts. For Kenny, it was a reminder that being open to that kind of instinct, even when it meant rethinking something that already felt finished, was part of what allowed him to keep growing as an artist, long after he'd already found success. Today, The Gambler is so familiar that it's easy to forget it was ever anything other than exactly what it is: the slow, patient, story-driven recording that millions of people know by heart. But somewhere in a Nashville studio on an afternoon in 1978, there was a version of that song that almost became the only version anyone ever heard. It wasn't a bad recording. It just wasn't the one that would still be playing decades later in kitchens and cars and quiet rooms across the country. The one that made an entire audience feel, for just a few minutes, like they were sitting across from the gambler himself, listening closely because he had something worth saying, and all the time in the world to say it.